Hello and welcome again. We were discussing those 7 questions to which we and those who seek to represent or serve us must know the true answers if we have any chance of achieving our desired end of a just and harmonious society. This is essential if we are to undo the centuries of deception and indoctrination to which many generations, including ours, have been subjected. Here we see on the screen again the 7. We've answered numbers 1 to 3 and number 6, so let's move on to 4, 5 and 7. Number 4 is, what is the defining principle of democracy? If we ask 1,000 people this question, almost all of them would say, voting in elections for people to represent us and carry out our collective wills. And they would all be wrong. Firstly, voting as we have been led to accept it carries the implicit assumption that the majority indicates the way that we should go. This is erroneous on several fronts, the most obvious being that most people don't give a huge amount of thought to the issues and the possible consequences of various policies being put into place. This is why so many enacted policies lead to unintended consequences. Most people are more concerned about safety and convenience than they are about standing up courageously to fight for a basic principle like individual freedom and responsibility. We only need consider the past 2 years to see that. As expressed by Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, truth always rests with the minority, and the minority is always stronger than the majority because the minority is generally formed by those who really have an opinion. When considered thoughtfully, it is superficial to accept that the majority view must be correct. The principle that an individual conscience acting in accord with natural law or truth has more validity than any number of thoughtless assenters is an essential component of true democracy. Nowhere else is this shown more clearly than in a trial, where all 12 jurors must agree on the defendant's guilt, or they must acquit. The basic principle of constitutional law is that an innocent person must be free. Under a constitutional trial by jury, a convener appointed by the people would answer questions on the law by jurors. To the jurors would fall the responsibility of deciding what was admissible evidence, the verdict and the sentence. Equally importantly, the jurors have the responsibility of deciding whether the law under which the accused stands before them is itself just. If the legislation in question breaches common or constitutional law, the jurors must reject it and the accused has no case to answer. The jurors would have capacity to annul any destructive legislation, which would place control of the government firmly in the hands of individual jurors. First, in cases of criminal offence, the accused would face a jury with adequate knowledge of the principles of common law. Many times they would know the accused and their true nature from years of interaction with them. This would enable these jurors to use their consciences about the likely intent of the accused. They would place themselves empathically in their circumstances and treat them as they would themselves expect to be treated were they in the dock. Highly paid magistrates and judges employed by the Crown and expected to do the Crown's bidding would not be part of the scenario, except probably as defendants in the dock for their crimes under the current regime. Under trial by jury, those who would be despots would understand clearly that such attempts would be short-lived with personally disastrous consequences. Any person harmfully impacted by legislation would be able to bring an action publicly funded against those who had enacted it. Harmfully impacted means suffered physical or emotional harm, a loss whether financial or of property or reputation, been fraudulently deceived, for example, by legislation worded ambiguously or in such a way as to be incomprehensible to the layman, resulting in loss, such as by fees or fines, or losses caused by breaches of the peace by alleged agents of the Crown, such as police unlawfully assaulting or arresting people exercising their lawful right to peaceful assembly or protest. For any such offences, a trial by jury of those responsible could be convened, wherein the individual legislators would face personal liability for any of the losses or harms caused. If any victims were harmed, those guilty parties would face possible complete asset stripping and very lengthy terms in prison. This would finally bring all members of society under the law and put an end to the iniquitous situation we now have, where those in positions of trust can abuse their powers, falsely acting as masters over the rest of society, who are excluded from the closed shop of the legalese system. Using this method, we would finally be approaching a true democracy, which, as we have been told since birth, consists of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Under this system of trial by jury, people would truly be able to vote directly for what affects them and their fellows. The main reason we don't have trial by jury is because it was statutorily removed by the infamous Bill of Rights of 1689. But long before then, even while Magna Carta 1215 was brand new, power brokers were seeking ways to subvert the Constitution, and the most effective of those discovered was to stealthily undermine and remove the right to trial by jury, because under that system, even a single juror could bring undone their malign machinations. Scottish philosopher David Hume describes trial by jury as, quote, an institution admirable in itself, and the best calculated for the preservation of liberty and the administration of justice that was ever devised by the wit of man, unquote. So the answer to question 4, what is the defining principle of democracy, is the individual acting in conscience in accordance with natural or constitutional law, holding those placed in government to personal account. This leads us on to question 5. What is the safeguard mechanism that protects people's capacity for self-determination through self-governance by putting the people in charge of government? It's a lengthy question, but the answer is short. It is trial by jury. That principle is embodied in Article 61, under which no Crown agent is freed from personal liability should they engage in treason by attempting to undermine the Constitution. That one clause stands supreme as a constitutional safeguard, above all other such safeguards ever devised. It affords every individual freedom from tyranny, with lawful excuse to defy unlawful demands, edicts and statutes, etc., without having to wait for nefarious politicians to amend Acts of Parliament. The more people follow the law and avail themselves of Article 61's protection, the sooner we can move towards establishing the trial by jury mechanism just discussed. Then on to question 7. Define the difference between knowledge and belief. The word knowledge derives from the Greek word gnosis, which means to know by observation or experience. Knowledge is verifiable and is thus independent of opinion. It can only be discovered or transferred. It cannot be created or destroyed. It may be lost, but merely awaits rediscovery. Knowledge gives clear direction to those seeking an end or goal, which in our case is freedom for all. It is a vibrational energy which can be used for positive ends to improve human lives. On the other hand, a vibrational energy that is not in the service of freedom is a belief. While knowledge stands as something which can be accepted or ignored, a belief demands constant repetition to counter any innate resistance, and is not ultimately verifiable by observation or experience. Knowledge doesn't encounter resistance because it stems from the energy source of which we are all a part, and knowledge thus transcends belief. Knowledge welcomes questions. Belief shrinks from them. Knowledge needs no compulsion. It is indifferent to whether we make good use of it or not. Belief, on the other hand, to be maintained, requires adherence to precept without supporting verification, and thus frequently entails compulsion or indoctrination, things which all too often lead not to freedom, but to slavery. The title of this video is Backward Vision, Forward Motion. Often, when in a position we don't like, it pays to look back to see how we arrived at our present state. If we then analyse correctly, we may find our way towards where we would rather be, using knowledge, not belief. Our current situation didn't suddenly spring into existence from nothing. It has evolved. If we look at the origins of humanity when people lived in small tribes or groups, we can see that then, as now, there was the risk of marauding attacks by outsiders or random criminal acts from within, or indeed other black swan events. To counter this, more influential ones would consult as to how they might protect themselves and the community. From these simple parameters, the idea of government was first formed. If someone could ensure the security of all, the community would support that individual or group for mutual benefit. The problem was that such drives were devised and administered by the cleverest, most capable, or often the most physically strong members. And while the weaker or less able desired security as much as anyone, they were prey to whatever cunning or force those placed in charge could execute. For thousands of years things were this way, and today is no different. Human nature hasn't changed. Most people are kind-hearted and peaceful, but there is a persistent small percentage who are narcissistic, sociopathic and psychopathic, and these tend to gravitate to places where they can acquire coercive power over others. Human knowledge, however, has changed. People have observed the outcomes of various methods of government, and 800 years ago a workable constitution was devised. Those with the most influence immediately sought to evade those provisions which protected people's rights and liberties, but the concept survived and today is in action. A couple of hundred years ago, a concept of government we called collectivism was formulated, which differed from previous forms, and this captured the imagination of many people who defined themselves as oppressed, as well as the attention of parts of the intelligentsia. Because no society had been structured this way, it was impossible to know whether such a system would be viable. It thus became a belief, and opposed to the knowledge already existing, that societies which allowed the greater degrees of individual freedom enjoyed greater degrees of peaceful prosperity. After almost 2 centuries, we can observe and verify that regimes which are run according to this belief, rather than the knowledge that freedom begets harmony, increasingly require greater degrees of compulsion to sustain themselves, and eventually always devolve into severe forms of dictatorship. This is because the belief system is not aligned with the impartial, neutral knowledge which stands in mute testimony that freedom is an essential component of a peaceful, harmonious society. Even our current versions of democracy are at severe risk of this descent into dictatorship, because not enough people have rid themselves of dangerous beliefs which cloud our vision and lead us towards slavery. There is no escaping the knowledge that for society to be peaceful and just, individual liberty must be the core principle upon which it is built. Using Article 61, each person must seize their own freedom. It cannot be given to people who are timid or unworthy, for it will be quickly snatched away by thieves and thugs. As ever, as Kierkegaard observed, the truth and the strength are with the minority. Until our next meeting, thank you for watching.